It was supposed to be a beautiful day, our 20th wedding anniversary. I had baked his favorite lemon cake the night before, picked out a navy blue tie that matched his eyes, and even framed an old photo of us from our honeymoon in Lake Tahoe. Mark kissed my forehead that morning, said he'd run out to grab coffee and never came back. At first, I wasn't worried. Maybe a flat tire, maybe work called, but hours passed. Noon turned to evening. His phone went straight to voicemail. His wallet was gone, but not his keys. The car was parked outside. By nightfall, I was calling the hospitals. I reported him missing, but the police said it was too soon. Maybe he just needed space, one officer shrugged. That wasn't Mark. Then at exactly 3:07 a.m. the house phone rang. The number was blocked. I picked up, heart pounding. A man's voice whispered just one sentence, "Don't look for him." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, hands trembling. Something was terribly wrong, and deep down I knew this wasn't just a disappearance. The morning after the call, I didn't sleep. I just sat on the kitchen floor, staring at my cold coffee. My hands trembled as I turned over every possible explanation in my mind. Maybe it was a prank, maybe it wasn't real, but Mark was still gone. I went through his closet first. Nothing obvious missing, except one thing. A small wooden box that used to sit on the top shelf. I hadn't looked in it for years, but I knew what it held. Photos, hospital bracelets, a tiny blue sock, all from our son Jacob. He died when he was 6. That box was Mark's way of keeping him close. I checked our joint bank account next. My breath caught. 2 days ago, Mark withdrew $5,000 in cash. That wasn't like him. We always discussed big expenses. The withdrawal came from a branch near his office, but I hadn't heard of any issues at work. No layoffs, no travel planned. Then I found the envelope, stuffed behind his sock drawer almost as if it had been forgotten. Inside was a picture I'd never seen before. Mark stood in a park, younger, maybe late 20s, and next to him a boy around Jacob's age, but it wasn't Jacob. This child had dark curly hair and eyes that mirrored Mark's, but I didn't recognize him at all. I flipped the photo over. Nothing written. No date, no names, just a faint coffee stain. I drove to my mother-in-law's house. She opened the door in her robe, eyes puffy with sleep. "Something's wrong," I said. "Mark's gone, and I found this." I handed her the photo. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't squint or ask who it was. She just froze, then sat down without saying a word. "Who is he?" I demanded. She clutched the photo to her chest. "You weren't supposed to find that," she whispered. "What are you talking about?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Before he met you, Mark made a mistake. A big one, that boy. He's part of that mistake." I felt the floor shift under me. "Is that his child?" Her silence was the answer. I drove home in silence. My mother-in-law's words echoed in my head. That boy. He's part of that mistake. What mistake, and why had Mark hidden this for decades? Back at home, I laid the photo on the kitchen table and stared at it until sunset. I tried to make sense of it. Who was this child? And more importantly, where was he now? I opened Mark's filing cabinet and started digging. Buried beneath old tax forms and car receipts, I found a small lockbox. I didn't have the key, but a paperclip and a little desperation worked wonders. Inside were dozens of transaction records, monthly payments, always the same amount, always to the same account. The payments started 15 years ago and had never stopped, even after Jacob's death, even after we nearly divorced from the grief. The name on the records, Angela Wilkes. I didn't know the name, but the address was real, somewhere in Oregon. I stared at the line for a long time. What was Mark doing sending money there all these years? Was Angela the mother of that child? I did what any half-broken, half-crazy wife would do. I packed a bag and got in the car. Oregon was 6 hours away, but I needed answers. I drove through the night with the photograph on the passenger seat and Mark's old hoodie wrapped around me like armor. When I pulled into the quiet neighborhood, I felt like a trespasser. Angela's house was small, pale yellow with wilting roses on the porch. I knocked twice. A woman answered, late 40s, auburn hair tied back, eyes sharp but tired. "Yes," I hesitated. "Are you Angela Wilkes?" Her face changed instantly, not recognition, fear. "I'm Mark's wife." She didn't invite me in. She didn't even ask how he was. She just stepped onto the porch, pulled the door closed behind her, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here. I need to know the truth." She looked around like the street might be listening. "There are things your husband never told you, and for good reason. Is that boy in the photo yours?" "No," she said softly. "He's ours." My breath caught. "You and Mark," Angela nodded slowly. "He came back into our lives after your son died. I told him to stay away, but he couldn't. Where is the boy now?" Angela stared at me for a long moment. "You don't want to go down this road, I'm warning you." I took a deep breath. "I already have. I didn't sleep that night, not in the motel, not even for a second." Angela's words haunted me. "He came back into our lives after your son died." What did she mean? Why would Mark revisit a child he'd hidden for decades only after losing Jacob? The next morning, I drove back to Angela's house. She didn't open the door this time, but I saw her car gone from the driveway. I followed her. She drove north out of town, past farmlands and narrow, winding roads until we reached a quiet facility tucked between pine trees. The sign out front read, Haven Creek Residential Center, a care home. I parked and waited. Angela walked in with a paper bag. 15 minutes later, I stepped through the same door. The front desk nurse looked up. "Can I help you? I'm here to visit." "My husband," I said, unsure if it was a lie. "Name, Mark Bennett." The nurse paused, then checked a list. "He's registered as a visitor here, comes once a week." "Who does he visit?" She looked hesitant. "A resident, Thomas Wilkes." I froze. The boy, the child in the photograph. I asked to see him. The nurse led me through a long hallway, the air tinged with bleach and lavender. When the door opened, I stepped into a small room with pale blue walls and toys neatly lined on shelves. A young man sat by the window, gently rocking back and forth. Maybe 19, maybe 20, curly dark hair, familiar eyes. He didn't look at me, didn't react at all. I sat across from him. "Hi, Thomas," I said softly. No response, just rocking. The nurse spoke behind me. "He's on the spectrum, severe autism. He doesn't speak." I stared, heart splitting open. This was Mark's son, and he'd been here the whole time, cared for, hidden, protected. And then I saw it on the nightstand beside him, a framed photo. Mark and Thomas both smiling, Mark holding a soccer ball. I touched the frame. It was recent. Mark had been part of his life all these years, and I hadn't known. I left the room in silence, but my soul was screaming. Thomas wasn't just a mistake Mark made long ago. He was a whole life Mark had lived behind my back. A secret family, a second son. I didn't know which part hurt more, the betrayal or the realization that part of him still loved, still cared, just not with me. Angela was waiting for me in the parking lot. "I told you not to come," she said coldly. "I had to," I replied. He's his father." She nodded slowly, arms crossed. "Mark started visiting Thomas again 5 years ago, after your son passed." "Why didn't he tell me?" Angela gave a dry laugh. "Would you have understood?" I stared at her, heart thudding. "So all this time, he's been living a double life." "No, just two halves of a broken one." I didn't know how to respond. Then she said something that turned my blood cold. "You think this is about love, about guilt. You don't know what he did." "What are you talking about?" Angela looked me straight in the eyes. "I didn't want Thomas. I begged Mark to let me give him up. He refused. He took him, raised him alone in secret, because Thomas isn't just a child. He's a promise. A promise. To someone Mark never told you about." Before I could press her, she got in her car and drove off, leaving me standing in a wave of wind and pine needles. I couldn't shake her words. Who was this someone? What kind of promise? I returned to Haven Creek the next day, hoping to find answers. Instead, I found Mark. He was in the common room, sitting beside Thomas, feeding him spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, gently humming an old tune I recognized from Jacob's bedtime routine. I didn't say a word, I just watched. He looked up suddenly, eyes locking with mine. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just nodded, as if he'd been expecting me all along. We didn't speak right away. Mark stood slowly, wiped his hands on a napkin, and gave the nurse a small nod. She took Thomas by the hand and gently led him out of the room. Silence hung between us like a fog. He gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." I stayed standing. "You lied to me." Mark nodded. "I did. For how long?" He exhaled. "Since before we married." The pain shot through my chest like a nail. "You had a child, Mark, a whole other life, and you let me believe I was your only family." "I was scared," he said softly. "I met Angela in college. It was complicated. She got pregnant and her family threatened to disown her. She didn't want the baby, said she'd leave him in the system." "So you took him?" He nodded again. "I couldn't let him be alone. I paid her off to keep quiet, and I found a facility to care for him once I realized he needed more than I could give. I visited, I paid, I stayed involved, just a part. And when Jacob died," Mark's eyes watered. "I broke. You were drowning in grief. I couldn't pull you out, but Thomas, he needed someone, and I needed to feel like a father again." My voice cracked. "Why not tell me?" He looked up. "Because I didn't want you to hate me." Too late. He took a step closer. "Everything I did to protect you." "No," I snapped. "You did it to protect yourself. You couldn't face the shame, the mess you made, so you made me live a lie instead." Mark fell silent. Then after a long pause, he said something I didn't expect. "Jacob wasn't supposed to die." Tears blurred my vision. "Don't. I mean it. I should have told you years ago, about Thomas, about everything. But I kept thinking just a little longer, just one more lie to hold us together. And now look." I turned away, every cell in my body screaming. "You destroyed what we had," I whispered. Mark replied, "I never meant to." I didn't speak to Mark again that day. I walked out of Haven Creek, got in my car, and drove aimlessly for hours. Through pine forests, past frozen lakes, winding roads that blurred through my tears. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was nearly midnight. My house looked smaller, like grief had shrunk it. I found my mother-in-law sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea like she'd been waiting. She looked up, saw my face, and said quietly, "So you know." "All of it," I replied. "Thomas, Angela, the lies." She closed her eyes. "Then there's one more thing you deserve to hear." I sat down, too exhausted to fight. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a faded envelope. "This was written 10 years ago, after Jacob's funeral. Mark never had the courage to give it to you." Inside was a letter, Mark's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed. Failed as a husband, as a father, as a man. Thomas is not just my mistake, he's my debt. To you, to life, to God. You don't know this, but I left Jacob alone that day. Just for 5 minutes. He wanted to ride his bike. I told him to wait. I went inside to take a call. When I came back, he was gone. My hands trembled. My stomach dropped. I thought he was hit by a car," I whispered. My mother-in-law nodded. "He was, but Mark blamed himself. That phone call, it was mine. I was the one who called him to argue about something petty. That call killed your son." I couldn't breathe. I begged him not to tell you. I couldn't live with the shame, so he carried it. I stood up, shaking. "You both let me live in the dark. You both chose silence over truth." Tears ran down her face. "We thought we were protecting you." "No," I snapped. "You were protecting yourselves." I walked out the door, the letter still in my hand. The world felt upside down. Nothing was what I thought it was. Mark hadn't just been hiding a son. He'd been hiding his own guilt, his own failure. And now I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal or the realization that I had blamed life, fate, even God, when all along it was them. It took me 2 weeks to return to Haven Creek, not because I wanted to see Mark, but because I needed closure. He was in the courtyard, sitting on a bench with Thomas beside him. They were feeding pigeons. The boy laughed softly, barely audible, but it was the first time I'd ever heard it. Mark looked up, surprised to see me, then grateful. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said. "I wasn't sure I would," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I didn't come to offer it," I said gently. "I came to say goodbye." He looked down at his hands. "I don't blame you. I read your letter," I said. "I know about the phone call, about Jacob." His whole body deflated. "I've lived with that moment every day. And I've lived without the truth," I answered. "That's worse." He blinked away tears. "I thought hiding it would spare you pain." "Lying never spares pain, Mark. It only delays it, and when it comes, it crushes everything." We sat in silence for a long time. Thomas leaned his head on Mark's shoulder, and Mark instinctively held him closer. "He needs you," I said, "and maybe you need him." Mark nodded. "I do." I stood. "I'm not your wife anymore, Mark. But I'm not your enemy either." He rose too. Is there any part of you that still?" I shook my head gently. "You broke too much, but I want you to be okay, for him and for yourself." We didn't hug, we didn't cry. We just stood in the quiet, two people forever changed by the same tragedies, walking away on different paths. And as I drove back home, I didn't feel empty. I felt something new, not peace exactly, but release. It's been a year since the phone rang at 3:07 a.m., a year since my marriage shattered, since truths were dragged from the dark, since I stood in front of the man I once loved and told him goodbye. I moved to a small town outside Spokane. Quiet, green, healing. I joined a support group for women with missing spouses, not missing because they vanished, but because they chose to live parallel lives. Each story broke my heart. Each one helped mend it. I work part-time at the library now. In the evenings, I write. I've started turning my story into something bigger, an open letter, a way to speak for women who never got the truth they deserved. Mark still visits Thomas. I hear from the center director sometimes. She says the boy smiles more these days. Every now and then I send flowers to their room, always sunflowers. No card, just something beautiful, something alive. I don't know if Mark knows they're from me, but that's okay, because some goodbyes aren't about closing doors. They're about opening new ones with grace. And sometimes, survival isn't about holding on, it's about letting go with love.